Welcome to Cyber Leaders with me, Ciaran Martin.
And me, James Lyne. Now, we're both here from the SANS Institute who are kindly backing this podcast. I myself am a techie, a massive geek, and I've spent my life chasing cyber criminals around the internet.
As will become particularly apparent in this episode, I am not technical, but together, James and I are trying to unpack the weird, wacky, wired and wireless world of tech security and all the complicated things that it involves.
Well, and a bit of empowering whilst we're on the way, I think, as well.
I hope so.
This podcast is ultimately a voice for security leaders. We want CISOs, security directors, and everyone beyond to build up their knowledge of what works, of what doesn't, to learn from each other's mistakes, and ultimately secure your organizations more comprehensively and quickly.
Indeed, that is why we're here. Now, I mentioned things that would become apparent today, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the old times for me, James. And back in the day, we had a saying at the National Cybersecurity Centre.
Oh, scratching the back of our brains today, are we, Ciaran? Well, what was the saying?
It was defending the UK one bit at a time. Good, isn't it? See what I did there?
I love a data pun. I might say I'll nibble. Anyway, never mind.
Yeah.
As mission statements go, Ciaran, I have to say that is one of the better ones. Well done. Good pun. Now, I'm assuming there was a point to this story, or are we just going to de-escalate into a series of ever-increasing geeky puns?
Both, of course. I'm going to ramble on, as I always do, but there is a point to this story because it presages the fact that the listeners are in for a real treat again today, but I'm probably not in for a treat because, in fact, this might be the end of whatever credibility I might have.
Oh, this is going to be fun. Well, I must admit, I'm completely confused by another one of your openings on this podcast, Ciaran. How can we have a guest you're very excited about, but anxious about at the same time?
Well, because I didn't come up with the slogan, our guest and his team did. I was his nominal boss, with the emphasis on the nominal, and it was the operations team at the National Cybersecurity Centre. So they hung it on the door to their ops room and all over the walls. I had nothing to do with it. But for years, like everything else that was done, I was trying to take the credit for it.
I like it. And so the specific risk today, aside from being outed for your unoriginal pun possession?
Well, the specific risk today is our guest is the person who ran that team, brought this brilliant unit together and had done it all for at least a couple of decades before he even started. And I feasted off his brilliant work for many years afterwards.
I'm starting to understand the problem. So what you're telling me is the great Paul Chichester, the National Cybersecurity Centre's Director of Operations, is today's guest. That is awesome. And you should be terrified. Frankly, we all should.
It is awesome. It's absolutely awesome. And I am terrified because there's nothing like suffering from imposter syndrome all your life and then having it fulfilled. But it's tremendously exciting to have Paul Chichester on.
Undoubtedly. He is one of the great figures of UK cybersecurity over the recent years. In fact, for many years, I've nicknamed him Dorian Gray because he never seems to age through these kind of great periods of time serving the NCSC. But you used to work directly with him.
Yeah.
So I'm going to let you do the honours of the introduction.
That will be my pleasure. Now, Paul Chichester, universally and henceforth in this podcast known as Chich, is one of the most important cyber defenders in the UK of our time. And sometimes we have guests on. It takes us a while to get to the point, as it does indeed here, but because they've got a long list of employers. Chich has been a single employer, GCHQ, for more than 30 years. And he's been a senior leader at the National Cybersecurity Centre, which is a part of GCHQ for the last decade or so. So he's had to put up with me for many years. And when I think about Chich, you tend to think about firsts. He's worked all over GCHQ on the intelligence, effects, and mostly on the defensive side. So he was part of the first groundbreaking operations when GCHQ got the power to conduct its own computer ops. But he and I will go to jail if we talk any more about that. So we'll move on. As I say, he's mostly focused on defence. He dealt with the first ever known nation-state set of cyber attacks against the UK way back in 2003. They marked the 20th anniversary of that a few years ago. And he was and is the first and so far the only Director of Operations at the NCSC. So, with a bit more explanation for non-British listeners needed in a moment, and probably some British ones too, I will introduce and welcome Paul Chichester, CMG MBE.
Good Lord. Well, thank you very much, both Ciaran and James. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you very much.
I hope you say that at the end of the show. But look, let's start with this. What does Paul Chichester CMG MBE mean?
Well, so the CMG and the MBE are part of the honours system in the United Kingdom. They're honours bestowed by the sovereign for a huge amount of different contributions that people in the country make. So for those in government, but those across the whole of the UK. And you yourself, I think, have a slightly more amusing one as well, which I'm sure we'll get into. But CMG is a companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George.
Yes, I do have a more amusing one. It's a companion of the Bath, which sounds a bit more like personal hygiene award.
Too easy, Ciaran. Too easy.
You've got two, so you're just being selfish. Anyway, thank you so much for coming on. It's brilliant to have you. James.
An absolute privilege. It really is. I think the summary for non-British listeners less familiar with the monarchy and our award system, Chich has seen some things and done some things, would be how I'd describe it.
Yeah.
So look, real privilege to have you here. Now, we ask everyone this question to show the diversity of ways that people got into cybersecurity leadership positions. If you can scratch the back of your brain some 30 plus years ago, tell us your path. Right? I know you grew up in South Wales. Were you a techie kid? Were you breaking things, ripping apart technology? How did you get started? Were you approached by a strange person in an alleyway telling you to go work for the secret state? How did it happen?
Well, actually, scratching the back of my brain is a damn sight easier than scratching the front of it these days at my age. So I still remember quite well those sort of times. And I'm afraid, if that's the right phrase, that I was a very geeky child.
You and me both, Chich.
So my first sort of memory is really a good friend of mine being bought a ZX81 for Christmas.
Beautiful bit of kit.
And we spent many, many happy hours poking in machine code to play Space Invaders and doing things like that for a while. And then joining the computer club in school, having the pleasure of coding a Research Machines 380Z, and then transforming the entire school with BBC micros. I'm afraid that I then did O-level, it's that long ago, computer science, and then I did an A-level, and then I went to university. And so I can do nothing but admit to my very geeky upbringing, childhood, and life thereafter.
I am sorry to say this, Chich. It feels mean, but several of those devices I have witnessed in museums in recent tours. But Ciaran, over to you.
Yes.
Well, I also had a ZX81. I know you'll both struggle to believe that, but you won't struggle to believe is I didn't really know how to use it.
Or turn it on, I suspect.
Well, let's not get too technical here. What was it like then, after that geeky childhood, going into that sort of strange period of history now, kind of before the dawn of the mass market digital age, end of the Cold War, everything seeming a bit okay, not quite the world we have now. Tell us about how you got into national security work and all of that.
So, there wasn't a person tapping me on the shoulder in an alley.
Well, not to join GCHQ anyway.
No, that's a different podcast. So no, I mean, for those, that will remember things like the milk round where the employees used to come round and encourage graduates to join them. GCHQ, even then in the late 80s, was one of those employers, and I rocked her. I'd already sort of started being interested in computer security, strangely, having caught my first hacker hacking a mainframe at university.
Wow.
I know, yeah, that's another story. Involved X25 pads and things like that for those that care about such things. And really having the bug for computer security and not finding many employers as a graduate who had an interest in such a thing. So my options were limited, mainly in government, and GCHQ was the place that offered me my first chance at dabbling in cybersecurity.
I wonder were there any other people in your intake who'd actually caught some hackers, but let's now get stuck in, because I genuinely think we're on episode 20-something or early 30-something of this podcast. I don't know. As you know me, Chich, I'm not a great details person. But you have more direct experience, probably than any other guest we've ever had, of the sort of direct attritional combat with the baddies, with the adversaries. And you're still active, you're still in service. So you just missed the Soviets, and you've established that. You've battled the Russians, the Chinese government, the Iranians, North Koreans, and of course, the cyber criminals, the whole lot. So over those 30-year period, what are the sort of things threat-wise that have concerned you most? Have there been any points where you thought this is acutely bad? Has it been consistent? How much has it changed? What sort of threats have worried you the most throughout that whole career of defending the UK in cyberspace?
I think the threat that worries me the most is the one that's probably at the top of our priority at any moment in time. And so when I think back over that journey, I mean, I think in the 90s, early 90s and late 90s, it was espionage. Everybody, The Cuckoo's Egg is a classic book written in the late 80s and, really sort of starts talking about states exploiting computer systems, and espionage was the thing that states saw, I think, cyber operations as being a hugely valuable tool. But then actually, the next thing comes along and, we started to see intellectual property theft into the 2000s. We started to see economic targeting through that period. And I think that, again, you at the moment in time, you think, wow, this is sort of transformational. And that's the greatest sort of threat that we need to worry about. And then we started to see disruptive attacks, DDoS attacks, affecting the financial services sector, affecting other parts of, industry and the economy. And all of a sudden, that's the next topic. And, we've seen disruptive attacks beyond that then. And, if I bring that up to today, I think probably sort of the way that cyber operations are being used by states for really all of the sort of geopolitical strategic aims they have. So it's not just one thing anymore. It's probably the thing that would worry me the most about state threats is really how it has become an integrated tool for states to conduct their geopolitical and, strategic aims. But that's just states. And I think actually for most of your listeners and, most of the people in the country, it's criminality and ransomware that really is now having the biggest impact. It is stopping us being able to conduct our day-to-day lives. And so as we talk today, ransomware is probably the thing that I worry the most about.
Well, let me just pick up on that. And by the way, I'll heartily endorse the recommendation for the Cuckoo's Egg book by Cliff Stoll. We'll put it in the show notes. I recall you giving me that book as one of my education pieces when I arrived at GCHQ.
Great book.
It's an absolute brilliant book. It's still an almost timeless guide to cybersecurity. But so you think of an organization like GCHQ, for US listeners, the NSA equivalent, and you think everything you've said about hostile nation states, it makes absolute sense, and they're using cyber as a holistic set of tools. And it's sort of an old problem in new form, but it's kind of what the organization's been doing for 100 years. But then you mentioned right at the end, for so many of our listeners, just being battered by these criminals all the time is something that's really what the primary worry is for lots of organizations. Just from your vast operational experience, how did this sort of happen? Were you surprised by it? You look back at the predictions 20, 30 years ago, sort of all the nation state stuff was kind of predicted. You could even argue it's not been as bad as some people predicted. But this whole rampant criminality and this just absolutely global explosion of badness, how did we get here?
So I think, criminals are perhaps the most innovative class of people on the planet.
Yeah, good point.
And so I think they have seen how our reliance on technology has developed and have exploited it. So a huge amount of, why are we where we are today is partly perhaps because we didn't learn the lessons from 30 years ago in Clifford Stoll and things like, good passwords and patching and trust relationships and all those things.
Yeah.
So I think, we can absolutely sort of put some blame on the criminals in this space, but we also need to take, I think, responsibility ourselves as individuals and organizations and recognize that this is something that we have leverage in, and actually we can reduce the harm from this ourselves if we do the right things.
Yeah, absolutely. I still remember the bit in the Stoll book where it's the US military and its early internet-based systems with the login as guest and the password as password. And there we are. Anyway, James.
That would never happen in...
Supply chain attacks surged to 245% from 2023 to 2024. And breaches like the Oracle Cloud breach, GitHub Action supply chain compromise, and vulnerabilities such as Log4j have proven just how one compromised supplier can disrupt thousands of organizations. Whether you're looking for comprehensive training, expert-led webcast, or ready-to-use templates and frameworks, the new SANS Supply Chain Security Hub has everything you need to secure your supply chain, from development to deployment. Explore our resources at sans.org/supplychain.
I've definitely seen that movie, but I suppose related to what you're saying here, Chich, I'm really interested in this because you've been around now a long time and seen an evolution of lots of different attacker tactics, new folks entering the scene, changes in technology, the whole gamut. And I remember just from my relatively short career compared to yours, kind of numerous inflection points, kind of seeing a particular threat or a particular change in tactic that really shifted my thinking about the industry and incidents. I remember watching SQL Slammer run rife around the planet and learning lessons about the potential speed of propagation of bad things in the event that, there's a lot of use of a singular technology. And I remember seeing ransomware that was never released to the public. It was sent to us in analysis labs because malware authors were demonstrating how clever they were, and then seeing that shift over to being used for commercial harm purposes and then realizing it was an ubiquitous way to make money. So I'm sure you've got a few of these. Can you think of any specific case or incident, maybe a group of them, that was really formative in how you now think about our approach to handling cyber threats, and any big inflection points through your career?
I mean, I was privileged to work on Moonlight Maze way back in the day. So if you like, in terms of the first point where we all started to think about how states might use cyber operations themselves, we'd all read The Cuckoo's Egg, but actually seeing it in the late 90s, I think for real, was a real seminal moment for the small bunch of people in the world whose job it was to care about it at that point. Ciaran touched on actually the more significant increase in nation state sort of targeting and use of cyber operations in the sort of early 2000s. And I think, a lot of people through that time, there's a sort of moment which is hard to sort of pinpoint, but I think the pivot from classic espionage to intellectual property theft in the late 2000s, probably. Everybody's got their own date for that. But I think that really shifted the landscape because it took the threat into a space where industry cared more. And I think for that moment of it not just being a government problem or a military problem or a defense industrial base problem, but actually a problem that touched a much wider part of the economy and society. I think through to the work we did responding to a series of, as I touched on earlier, the financial services DDoS attacks. That again was a sort of moment where I think we really sort of paused for breath. I really sort of remember the Sony North Korean hacks around that period of time, which again, I think a lot of people will remember as, again, one of those things where you're just sort of looking at it going, well, didn't see that coming. And actually then beyond that sort of really changing. And then the disruptive attacks. WannaCry, I'd have to mention WannaCry, given it was such a seminal moment in the NCSC.
I could see Ciaran twitching in discomfort at the mention.
Turn my camera off, maybe my microphone too.
But similarly, around that time, the same year, I seem to recall NotPetya.
Yeah.
Again, the Télé Saint-Monde Colonial Pipeline was probably a biggie in terms of, it wasn't just them, but again, there was a series of attacks that all of a sudden really started to show ransomware and criminality impacting our daily lives. So there have always been those sort of moments that I think folks look back on. There are probably dozens of others, but those are certainly the ones that spring to my mind.
And that's an extraordinary tour de force. We've dragged it out of you, everything that you've been working on, working backwards from disruptions of US pipelines, Colonial Pipeline, to crazy sort of viral attacks where the hackers got it wrong. NotPetya, the Russians misfiring when they attack Ukraine and affecting chocolate factories and shipping and all of that. WannaCry messing up healthcare. Sony releasing George Clooney's emails because the North Koreans didn't like the movie. And all the way back to one of your favourites, James, Moonlight Maze, the Russians hacking into the US and other classified government agencies. Extraordinary stories.
I do like, there's a couple of nerdy details under there as well. I'll quickly share and we'll get back to our point. But we've had many times the debate of the difficulty of attribution in our industry. And I remember around NotPetya and its variants, all these articles popping up on who had done it because of the exclusion of Ukrainian keyboard layouts from being infected. And this kind of finger pointing of, it must be the Ukrainians. Oh, no, it must be the Russians pretending not to be the Ukrainians. And all this kind of wonderful guesswork that was going on early in the campaigns, kind of highlighting the early attribution problem, which of course now, like many of the things Chich is describing, we take for granted.
Yeah.
We've absorbed these kind of attacker tactics and kind of goals into our thinking. It was all transformative at the time. And you're right, I do love Moonlight Maze, but of course for its origins, it's kind of going back in time and establishing this whole pattern, but also because it's got one of my favorite pub quiz facts in it, where there was this claim from investigators. I'm going to try to get this right now because someone will fact check us, but
probably Chich.
Exactly, yeah. It could be real time. If you took all the information that was stolen and it was printed out and stacked, they claimed it would be 3 times the height of the Washington Monument, which of course back then sounded impressive, but by the scale of modern data is kind of underwhelming, isn't it?
Well, indeed. And Moonlight Maze, for the non-aficionados, we're going right back to sort of 1996, 1997, 1998. But I'm going to take you back to the present, Chish, and I'm going to ask you a slightly unfair and possibly from your point of view, risky question. So you're there in terms of the UK cyber defense pyramid, you're right at the top. So you deal with the worst things. And you've been there in Cobra, which for US listeners is what we would call the situation room. And so anybody who's watched a Hollywood movie, that's the sort of thing. So you're there for the most impactful events. And we talk in bureaucratic and boring planning terms about things like a realistic worst case scenario. So here and now, and I know you have to be a bit careful and you don't want to panic people and so forth, but what's the sort of realistic worst case scenario that might drag you down to the National Crisis Management Centre to deal with the cyber crisis with the Prime Minister and the Cabinet and all of that? What's the thing that would be top of your worry list right now?
Well, I think to sort of remember that whilst there's probably a lot of talk about nation states and cyber Armageddon, that isn't the thing actually that I think, if I'm sitting here now, drags me down to the Cobra room.
Indeed, you once gave me a book called Cyber War Will Not Take Place. You've given me a veritable library of things to try and not overhype things. But yeah.
And I still think Thomas was very prescient and was right.
Great Thomas Rid book, yeah.
I think that isn't where we are. I think, as I said earlier, states are actually very thoughtful about how they integrate cyber operations into their wider aims. And look, if we were in a crisis or a conflict, then states would probably be looking at using that capability, but that's not where we're sitting today. And so the thing that I think all of us need to be probably more thoughtful about is that ransomware threat. And I know I keep coming back to that, but we've seen repeatedly this year already how that can really impact our daily lives and can really impact UK businesses, global businesses. It can affect people's jobs. It can affect their, well-being. We've had some, again, I think, this year, sadly, the recognition that potentially the first actual death from a ransomware attack.
Yeah, indeed.
So those are the things that I think day to day will likely trigger that sort of level of response, because sadly, they are still the most likely to happen.
Yeah, look, let's continue this theme of our responses here. Now, look, you started out in GCHQ when no one knew what it was doing. And to your prior commentary, frankly, a lot of the mission was evolving on the fly as various actors around the world were changing tactics and technology was evolving. And you and others built up this incredibly powerful intelligence-based defense system that largely operated completely in secret. Now, all of that is much more out in the open, a real tone shift, particularly in the last 10 years. What do you think has been behind that change? And what do you think we're getting better at? What do you think we have yet still to tackle? Would you like to go back to secret dark corners and hide all of this? I suppose that's a follow-on as well.
Well, some days, but no, I think
Mondays.
Mondays. Yeah. Why has that changed? I mean, I think partly because the external environment has changed. These are things, I mean, to some degree, not talking about them wasn't necessarily because we wanted to keep it secret. It was more that there wasn't a place to talk about it. And actually, if you look, some of us who worked in CSG, well before the NCSC, we did talk in the public domain. There weren't many people necessarily listening or interested in what we said, apart from government and a smaller set of people. I think there's been a huge shift in the last 10 years in actually the relevance and the importance of this topic for the public. And so I think that's been part of it. I think, obviously, again, and I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think the setting up of the NCSC, one of the real challenges and gauntlet that was sort of laid down was being more open and being more transparent and being more accessible. And that was a fundamental principle. And I think at the core of our mission was to communicate to everybody in the United Kingdom, to everybody in the country. And I think that drove that real need to be transparent. It's important. We need to talk about the threat. We need to talk about the risk, and we need to talk about how to fix it.
I do think that there have been a lot of positives from this shift to engaging the public. I would attribute a great deal of work in the private sector, kind of innovations have flowed from what the NCSC has shared. I think it's been a real success story, actually, of shift there to being in the public eye. More to do, of course, but I would say a huge success from my side on the industry, having watched it evolve.
Well, I'm obviously not going to disagree with that, but let's drill down a bit more. So you've built this formidable machinery, as James said, building on intelligence, but using it for cyber defense. You've dragged the place out into the open from the old days of CSG, which I believe stood for Communications Electronic Security Group. Am I right?
Very good.
What that meant, God knows.
UFLA, it's going on a t-shirt.
Anyway, and now you've got this formidable capability and everybody knows about it. So you could say, you may not agree, but almost you're like the last line of defense. We talk about layered defense, but if it get past you and your team, there's not a lot left. So given that we talk about, billions of events every day, and we talk about scams and minor data breaches and all sorts of things, there's only so many of you in your team. How do you decide what to get involved in? You can't be the national IT help desk. You don't want to be. That's not really the way things should work. So how do you decide what matters and where to deploy these resources that you've got that are incredibly important, but like all resources, finite?
So I think what's really changed over the last 10 years is perhaps back then we were perhaps playing in one position on the field. I won't sort of take that sporting analogy too far, but, I think we understood where we fitted. I think what we've had to be over the last 10 years is a much more agile, sort of universal player in the team and be really impact-led. So if that impact is from a state actor, then that's where we have to see where we can add value. But if that impact is from theft at scale against the citizen, then we have to be there as well. And I think that agility and flexibility for us is critical. I think the other part of that, though, is recognizing that, say it was a 6-a-side team 10 years ago, it's a sort of 15-a-side team now, and it's getting more and more. So I think two things to say there. One, we are increasingly not alone in that space. In fact, we're the minority, so we have to understand that. And secondly, I think that brings its own complexity and challenge in terms of how you operate as a team. But operating as a team is perhaps the most important thing now, not what any one of us can bring to it.
Well, two quick follow-ups on that. Firstly, I wasn't going to do this, but when you started talking about going to 15 aside, I thought I would just gloss over the travails of your beloved Welsh rugby team, because this is a family podcast, so I don't want any swearing. But one of the things then about the team, and I think this is a genuinely important point. So I was in more, if you like, normal parts of the government before working with you. And in the more normal parts, and I'm not particularly proud of this, but you're kind of taught to treat the private sector as sort of, at worst venal, but at best amoral. They're just there to make money and pay tax and so forth. Yeah. You guys, look, I'm on the other side now. But, they can't be of any real use to government. I go there and you have got this formidable set of integrated partnerships with all these companies, and it seems to sort of work. Tell us about that, how it came about, how useful it was, how you sort of did something that certainly the British government, other governments can speak for themselves, but the British government wasn't traditionally very good at.
I think sort of a number of reasons behind that. I think there's something about the nature of the domain and the topic and sort of cybersecurity, which I think actually government and industry's sort of been on the journey about the same length of time. So I think that, having worked other intelligence missions and other topics, we had been in that world for 10 decades, over 100 years, and there wasn't an industry partner. Almost from the first moment of cyber and cyber attacks being a thing, if you like, even in the 90s, I think industry was there. And so I think we started on the journey together. And I think that meant that we probably had a lot of sort of shared and common sort of background. I think partly from me personally, I saw very early on when I was doing pen testing for government penetration testing in the early 2000s, and the UK government at that point realizing it couldn't service the demand itself. So us even at that point recognizing that industry through a thing called the check scheme and our partnership with industry, where we really looked to industry to help us do that sort of penetration testing. And then, through all of the moments, and actually a lot of those instances I talked about, I can remember in every one where actually there was a close partner in industry who was actually a vital part of helping us understand and counter that particular threat at the time.
It is funny, Chich. Such an apt description. I remember some of the early days of these discussions where public and private sector kind of getting around the table, talking about these problems, some of these discussions with you and others. And there was this kind of, hey, we'd like to do X, but we know you can't do that in the private sector because of these legal or commercial constraints. And I remember this kind of, no, I think we could do that. That would be okay. But there was this kind of idea that there was going to be this unwilling partner problem and all these difficulties. And actually, when it came down to individual analysts and leaders and security team owners, there was much more willingness to go after this stuff than I think folks had anticipated. And folks like you, I think, did a wonderful job of navigating through those concerns, of getting to a place where there's a lot of collaboration today. And we just can't afford to lose that. Cyber criminals spend all their time in forums online, selling each other tools and practices and sharing what works. And if they're exchanging tactics and we aren't, because of restrictions around IP or kind of more arbitrary commercial concern, we're all just weaker for it. So it's just remarkable to see it evolve, and I think another success story. Not that the mission is accomplished there. There'll be some new challenges. I'm sure AI will find some way to make this difficult again. But Chich, if I may, I wanted to pivot in a slightly different direction, because I'm always nervous of the clock ticking away when we have a guest like you that could cover the entire spectrum of the history of cybersecurity.
I fear you're not that nervous.
Well, exactly. We do have a wonderful editor, don't we? So look, we're talking about trends in the threat, what we've seen over time. Now you may be more in the kind of continuity or revolutionary space when it comes to technological change. I don't know. As we keep saying, you see more of these threats than almost literally anyone else, or at least your teams. So when we talk about AI and other new technology, is it true, as some claims we see in the media, that adversaries are racing ahead all the time? AI is going to kill us all, probably tomorrow, probably yesterday, and we haven't noticed yet. Or is it, as others say, the same old problems over and over again in new packaging? You're a voice of reason individual. How do you think about this stuff?
I was asked this recently, and I think perhaps like many things in this domain, when you've been here a while, you can probably give an answer, as a witness for the prosecution or a witness for the defense. And so I think, two views on that. I think we are absolutely seeing adversaries of all kinds leveraging AI tools and capabilities. So it would be silly to say they're not doing that. Have I seen that lead to a dramatic change in impact? Not yet. And I think there is no doubt that probably the way I would describe it is that adversaries using it as a productivity tool. So that, yes,
you've got to save time when you're trying to steal money from people, Chich. You've got to pump those numbers.
But similarly, it's a productivity tool that I see being used by defenders too. And I've seen some amazing sort of innovation actually from a number of industry partners in using AI and agentic AI and things like that to start really getting after some of these things. So I think it will always be an arms race. I think there's no doubt that some of that productivity increase will allow criminals to be more productive and therefore have more impact. But I suppose I'm sort of generally sort of close to glass half full on that. I think it is something that will, again, be a moment where we look back on and we will reflect that, there was a sort of point there of inflection. But I suspect that point of inflection won't be September 2025 and we'll all remember the day. It will be, roughly between about 2024 and 2029, something happened and we kind of rolled with it. And that's kind of how I see it. Let's get together again in sort of 5 years' time and see how prescient or otherwise I was.
Careful what you promise.
We've got a verbal contract, Ciaran. He's committed to another podcast. Get that in the calendar quick. He's hard to schedule. I'm admitting confirmation bias because what you describe aligns to my worldview. It's clearly consequential for both attackers and defenders. Not saying it's a kind of fizz without a bang, but it's not as disruptive as the internet, as some folks have kind of labeled, right? And I do think it's going to be a series of acts of progress on the attacker side and the defender side, as opposed to some exponential increase in capability overnight. But I suppose continuing this theme, whilst you've got your crystal ball out, let's talk about the security of the technology we're using. I think we've made a lot of progress here as an industry. I mean, if I look at old operating systems and their fundamental resilience and legacy languages, we have built in so many more safeguards that make life harder for attackers over the years. A real success story. I've gone from lambasting Microsoft as the progenitors of the malware problem to being pretty impressed by their efforts and innovations there, for example. How do you think about this? Are we ever going to get much better at securing the underlying technology we use? Is this as good as it gets? I mean, we've suffered from these core weaknesses for years. We've made some progress, but there's still a lot of exploitation and even more surface area. So better, worse, about the same? Doomsday is next week. What do you think?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I think, similarly, you can be an optimistic day and a pessimistic day in that space. And for me, very often that will depend on which part of my day job I've been working on. I think someone like Ollie Whitehouse, our CTO, who is an incredible, real, optimist on what we can achieve in terms of increasing the security of technology out of the box and is doing, incredible work to try and do that. And, our secure by design, secure by default work that, we and allies have been pushing, I think is really, really important. I actually look at a lot of the technology there. There are more organizations today that I work with than ever that I can see using modern technology and being hugely resilient because of it. So I think we have real evidence now that we have exemplars. We have people that using the modern technology, using some of the amazing capabilities that companies offer with great people, tools, technology, process. There are definitely organizations we work with every day that I would consider exemplars. And I probably wouldn't have said that 15 years ago, right? So
Yeah.
I'm absolutely sort of very positive, but almost there's more harm than ever. So how do you sort of square that away? And so I think there is definitely a sort of an existence proof, if you like, that it can be done. I think the challenge for all of us is how we drive that and what are the levers that we as a society need to wield to make that happen, both government and business and the citizen. And I think it's on all of us to try and work out how we work together on that. But I think, there is a path to sort of resilience there. It's not easy and it's probably not cost-free, or certainly not cost-free. I think as consumers, we need to be more demanding for security. That will drive people developing systems to do that. Government has a role there. I mean, we have our cybersecurity resilience bill coming through. There are other pieces of legislation that government's pushing, developing. So I'm actually sort of optimistic because of all of that. But yeah, I would be fibbing if I said, there are days when it's hard to be that optimistic. So, you get both there, I think, in the answer.
No, and pragmatic optimism, I think.
Yes.
I like it. We get a lot of doomsday and scaremongering in the cyber industry already, and it's often, I think, not very helpful. For me, you mentioned a couple of interesting things there. There seems to be more attacks, more impact, more surface area. But you also talked about the improvements. And I think that's actually a bit of a success story for the industry because there is more attack, more surface area, more interest. The changes we've made to the resilience of our technologies are why it's not so much worse. I don't think we should be measured by the elimination of threats. I think we've held back the horde quite valiantly with some of these changes. So whilst there's clearly more of a problem to solve, I actually think we've done some version of quite well.
I think that's a really important point because I think I've certainly also seen a real shift. We are making our adversaries change their tradecraft. We are incurring cost on what they're doing. We are making it harder. And we are overall sort of looking at, I think, more of our economy and society every day that is getting resilient. And I think that's it. It's always easy to look at the negative part, if you like. But, we are very fortunate to work with some amazing organizations who absolutely have resilience front and center, that, it's at the board level, it's integrated into the culture of the organization. As I say, there are far more exemplars now than ever before. So I think that has to be the thing that sort of motivates us to keep going.
I agree. And look, I give one quick nod to one other remark you made in there that I want to underline for people because I just hear it from security leaders every week at the moment. We're living in the golden age of security defenses and technology. We've never had more capability to build resilience, to make life difficult for the cyber criminals. But you mentioned the other parts of the triangle, people and processes, and you've got to have the right people, the right skills to actually use this stuff. And I say that, yes, I know it sounds a little self-serving, SANS, cybersecurity training company, but hold on here. There's a non-commercial point. I talk to so many security leaders who've bought so much capability they haven't got around to deploying because they don't have the people, they don't have the bandwidth, the time, the skills to get it deployed. So one of my little call to actions out of the back of Chitch's remarks here is make sure you're prioritizing that stuff and maybe slow down some of the buying of shiny boxes and technologies and make sure you've got the people and process side able to capitalize on it.
Well, let me jump in here because...
Yes, I'm capitalizing Chitch.
Otherwise we'll go on even longer than one of those NCSC board meetings, although much more productive. Now look, let's talk about people before we have to go. You've done an awful lot building human capabilities. You've been head of profession and so forth. People bang on about skills crises and all of that. James is just talking about businesses can't operate capabilities they've bought because they don't have the people to do it. Are you glass half full about the cyber workforce, your own workforce? What's the state of play there, Chich?
I'm definitely more than glass half full because, again, I suppose I've been privileged to see the trend, if you like. So we continue to increase the number of people with skills that are really valuable and important. Now, again, you can look at the other side of that coin and say, are there enough of them?
Sure.
Are we doing it quickly enough? And that's a different maybe conversation. But I think fundamentally, again, sort of the cyber workforce continues to grow. People who really are making a difference, the numbers continue to increase. I mean, again, my own plug for things like the cyber first work we do, the bursaries work, a huge amount of cyber first opportunities that are there, the work we're now doing with DCIT to really grow that tech first workforce, I think is really important. Again, it can't just be on us. I mean, to your point, James, about those sort of people process technology, the one thing, if I had to say on this topic to businesses, is get the people bit right first. Invest in apprenticeships, invest in training your people. They will then drive the technology acquisition and the process. But if you come at this from the other way round, you're just not going to achieve the effect you want. It's not an overnight thing, but really, I think embracing that point about growing the talent, growing the workforce. And I think don't just necessarily go and try and buy somebody who's an expert, because there aren't many of those around. But if you're willing on investing in people who are enthusiastic, have the right mindset, are inquisitive and keen to learn, then I can't think of a better talent pool out there to turn into the cyber defenders of the future.
Hear, hear.
Well, then, I think our last question to you then is to give you that opportunity yourself to appeal for people. So there are two ways in which you can find out what it's like to work for you in cyber operations at GCHQ. One is to watch Channel 4's The Undeclared War, where the world-famous comedy actor Simon Pegg plays a character that is pretty much entirely based on you.
They asked Chich, but he was too busy, I believe.
The other way of doing that, if you don't want to watch The Undeclared War, or as well as, is to hear you now essentially say, why would you want to work at GCHQ in cyber defense? Why might you come to the National Cybersecurity Centre? What's it like? And how would you pitch it?
I mean, clearly I'm biased. I think it's one of the most privileged positions you can be in because you get to see both sides of so much of history play out, the sort of public side and very often the non-public side. And that's true for the sort of cyber world. Actually, we spend more time working on things that don't get into the public domain because hopefully we're making a difference. And I think it's a privilege to sort of work there. I've been very fortunate. And I think this is generally in government. But for me, as a technologist, being able to almost have 4, 5 or 6 different careers in one place, I think is obviously, very unique in a very large employer. But also I would be overselling it to say there isn't some monotony too. We are a big bureaucracy. When The Undeclared War, we were working with them on, I think, they were nervous that we wouldn't portray it realistically because we take all of that stuff out. And we absolutely understood that, this is a drama and you kind of need to keep your audience. But actually, in all seriousness, the days where you really are making an impact more than enough counterbalance the other parts. And it's an incredible privilege to work there, as you know.
Indeed, I do. And thank you for everything you have done. We are going to try to wrap up, but we have to get to James's favourite bit of the show first before we leave it. So, James, over to you.
My favourite bit. Well, yes, look, as you know, it's only fair. We're asking people to listen to us, sharing all these wonderful stories from days gone past in cybersecurity. We give them something actionable at the end. So
we are asking you for
your 30-second takeaway. So, Chich, as I said, kind of ultimately, this podcast is about lessons for cybersecurity leaders. So if you had just 30 seconds with a cybersecurity leader, something to pay attention to, something to ignore completely, something to invest in, something to de-invest, whatever it might be, what would you advise them?
So I think, we've talked a lot about incidents today as well. And clearly, so my answer is going to be in that sort of realm. I think the thing I would say, and am saying to boards and CISOs and organizations and individuals even at the moment, is really make sure that you have a plan for an incident. And I think that's not just a sort of set of playbooks about what you would do to respond to the incident, but increasingly it's how do you continue operations whilst recovering. A lot of organizations focus on recovery and forget that they actually still need to operate. And so there's a sort of real business bit there. It's not just a technical bit. So I think, what is your continuity and response plan as a cyber leader?
And figuring it out before you need it and maybe practicing a little bit as well.
Quite a lot, yes.
And that really matters, especially if some of these nation states, the moonlight maze people in their modern form, start to behave like the criminals and unleash chaos. So that's a slightly negative way of putting it. But actually, I think the one thing from the whole range of things you've said, Chich, is that what's extraordinary about you, one of the many extraordinary things about you, is given everything you've seen and put up with and everything you see on a daily basis and have done for years, you're still optimistic about our ability to do that. And that's another takeaway for me from this. But with huge thanks to you, not just for appearing on the podcast today, but for everything you've done over your very long and distinguished career in cyber defense. Thank you so much. And that is it, apart from the normal request for feedback on the show.
The critical feedback, follow-up questions for Chich for when he comes back in 5 years. We need those too, of course. Anything.
Yes, we do ask what's keeping you awake at night. Is it this podcast or is it sending you in the opposite direction? Not sure which we'd prefer, but you can leave us feedback at the podcast site or you can email us at cyberleaderspodcast@sans.org. All that remains to say is...
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening. Keep cybering. And from me, Ciaran Martin.
And me, James Line.
It's goodbye.
And delete your nibbles safely.